Well, I thought the theme of the day was Scouts, and which involves Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, and also my participation at MSI
Yeah, well, we were,
is both.
That's
So
okay.
you put it either way.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Which would you care to start with? If we're going to do 2 sessions, thank you so much for doing that. Would you like to do the Scouts today? Would you like to do UT the next time? Or what order would you like to present? It's up to you.
I guess get MSI out of the way. It's a little tougher to do than Scouts.
Okay. Then before we start, since I was thinking Scouts today.
Well, we can do Scouts.
That's okay. I can
It doesn't
change.
matter either way.
I can change channels. Tell me a little bit about what your outline is regarding that topic. In other words, just some of the big highlights.
Yeah, okay,
Give me a
that's
little
all
idea.
Yeah, that's all I got down as
That's
highlights.
okay.
I don't like to try to think of what I'm gonna say until I say it.
Okay.
And first time I went through this last night, I went through this and I started putting down all these names. And I thought, well, I shouldn't leave anybody out. And I wound up with 1,000 names. I thought, my God, what can you just have to forget about that and really think about things that happened or stories and all. And understand I got nothing on science. I can't get into science. That was one thing that wrong with that old interview, as I recall, is you got a guy who knows nothing about science trying to summarize the things. So, no, here's what I had, and I don't know that it even makes that much sense, but it kind of developed to me. I was going to start out with the first time I ever came to Port Aransas, because it's kind of a good little story with sailing over here, getting in problems with a boat and all. And then the next time was when I came over here to interview for my job with the lab, which I didn't get at the time. But it happened that that one day that I happened to be there, I just happened to be at the time where something really funny and interesting happened. And I didn't realize it until later, years later. I didn't put 2 and 2 together and realize what had happened. It makes a pretty good story. It makes a pretty good story, you know. So I kind of wanted to start my MSI with that, and getting hired.
Okay.
And then I thought I went to work in 1960, and so I thought just shortly, just to describe what it was like there, as far as the buildings were.
Early days.
Early days. For instance, they just had a few little labs, air conditioned, and I wound up bringing a ceiling fan that came out of my dad's house and building a box around it, put it in the classroom so that people could survive the summer there.
What was after early days?
I was going to talk about in early days the ship and what happened to it, and then start kind of and talk about the Lorraine for just a minute, which was a boat we had for 20 years.
Would that be the Longhorn?
No,
the Lorraine is,
the Lorraine, which is a boat we had in 1960 to 1980.
Oh, that's the ship you're referring to. Okay.
Yes, the Lorraine. And
Yeah.
and then I could talk a little bit about what I did, some early work I did there, which was helping with some of the scientific projects were kind of interesting, because it was
Okay.
I was a guy out of business school that knew nothing at all about anything except I volunteered to work on a beach net project, and I wound up being in charge of a helicopter net project. And
What's after science projects?
and I was going to, I group a lot of things that happened by hurricanes, and I got a couple of little interesting stories about Hurricane Carla, and then a couple about Hurricane Celia.
Okay.
And then Celia, it leads right into the Longhorn, because we got the Longhorn as a direct result of Hurricane Celia.
Okay.
And then, and there's a few I was gonna say a few things about the Longhorn and a couple of the captains and this old cook we had named PAPHA who was an interesting character. And then, just in passing, I was gonna mention some early things that happened. One little early thing that happened in the visiting class program, which later turned into Marine Education Services as Rick Tennant took over. And the library and publications, because I hired my wife and put her name in there.
Okay.
And I wanted, in the maintenance section, I'd like to, there's something on the historical on the lab. I feel like old Jerry Clanton needs to have his name in there. And the office, Joanne Page and Lynn Amos.
Okay.
Now, I don't
That's
know
under
whether-
maintenance, right?
What?
It's under maintenance.
No, the office is separate.
Okay.
Maintenance is one.
And that's a lot of topics. So what I would invite you to do is, that's probably about all we can cover.
Yeah, well, that's everything except for Oceanography Day, which can go with Scouts.
Yeah, you might hold up to scouts. What I'd invite you to do in the names, instead of taking the time right now on the names after the interview's over and we shut down, if you would like to then go through each of your categories and pull out some important names, I can write those down here. And those can be added to the record later.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of going through just literally a directory of names in each topic, which you said earlier, that could be a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I'm not gonna have that.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna remember, I completely abandoned that.
Okay, good, because I think that historically, the history of the facility and the unique perspective you can bring to it is going to be more important than the names.
Yeah.
Okay, are we ready to roll?
it's rolling.
This is,
It is.
yeah, we're gonna start our interview now, and this is the 11th day of January 2011, and I'm Guthrie Ford, and Mark Crichton is accompanying me in this interview of Mr. John Thompson. We're in Mark's home, and it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're going to conduct this to about 2:33. And welcome, Mr. Thompson. John. Please call me John or Guthrie, either one. And I'm glad you're here today. Thank you for being part of this Town Association project to interview folks about the historical aspects of Port Aransas. And in the outline that you discussed, I'd invite you to start with your coming to Port Aransas, Texas.
Okay. Well, you know, when I went to high school over in Corpus, Ray High School. When I finished high school, I wasn't interested in going to college. I wanted to build a sailboat. And while I was in junior college over there in Corpus, I built a little sailboat, which I named the Mary Tornes, which was a little flat-bottom sailboat. And the significance of that boat is that's how I got to Port Aransas the first time. As far as I can remember, the first time I ever came to Port Aransas is my brother and my uncle and I got in this little Mary Tornes, which could sail in really shallow water. And we started out over the Laguna Madre and headed for Port Aransas. And we made a mistake. Instead of heading over towards Ingleside where you can hook up with a ship channel, well, we thought we could sail in shallow water, and we headed in this big shallow area that's back behind the spoil banks. And it looked like in the distance there were some openings between the spoil banks. And they weren't where we thought they were. And we went and we went and we hit the bottom, and it was too far to turn back. So we kept trying to go, and we kept trying to go, and we wound up, we had full sail up, and we were out walking alongside the boat. And I made the mistake of not having any shoes on, and I stepped on oyster shells or something that cut my feet up. So we were hours and hours before we finally got to Port Aransas. And when we got to Port Aransas, we went in. At that time, the hider had the old Wilson's Grill down by the water. And so we went to that place, not realizing that that it was really a pretty doggone nice restaurant. And we went in there without any shirts on, and he had a nice rug, as I recall, and my feet were bleeding, and I bled all over his rug, and this kind of elegant black man came up and asked us what the heck it was that we wanted, you know. So that was my first encounter with.
And what year would that be,
Port
John,
Aransas.
more or less?
That would have been about 1957.
Yeah.
And
Is that the year you graduated from high school?
no, 55 is when I graduated, and it took me a couple of years by the time I guess I didn't come over here as soon as I built that boat. That was a year or two after. Yeah, and so we made, every time I went to Port Aransas after that for a couple of years, it was always not by automobile, but by sailing across in the Maritornis, but I had enough sense to go down the channel and not try to shortcut through the spoil banks.
If you wanted to drive to Port Aransas from North Padre in those days, I think the Island Road went in at about 53 or 54. Do you remember the Island Road in that era?
No, I don't remember it in 53 or 54. I remember when I had my new International 57 pickup truck. I can remember going to the gate toll over there and asking the fellow at the gate if the beach was such that it was open, whether I could drive down to Port Aransas. He said, "Well, you can drive down to Port Aransas. There's a highway right down the island." And I said, "Oh, I didn't realize that."
Was that when you were paying $2 at that gate or $1? Do you remember?
I think it was $1.
Okay. And was that gate right after the swing bridge? Was it on Padre or was it in Flower Bluff
It was
before
Flower Bluff. Yeah.
before you came in?
Yeah, and then you had the old, you had to go across two bridges that were swing bridges, they were called. First one was at Humboldt Channel and the other was at the Intercoastal, and I commuted for 7 years, and when you were late for work, boy, it was heck on your automobile, and you'd hit those swing bridges and make a big racket, and the bridge tender would come running out of his little house and shake his fist at you.
Well, you discovered Port Aransas, and that grew into quite an evolving Port Aransas.
Yeah, that's through my work at the Marine Science Institute. And funny thing was that living in Corpus and attending the University of Texas, I graduated with a business degree from the University of Texas. I had never heard of the Marine Science Institute, and I got onto the Marine Science Institute when I was looking for a job. I'd been out of the University of Texas just long enough for 6 months in the Marine Corps. And then I was trying to find employment, and I was registered with the university, and they didn't tell me about the job, but a private employment agency did. And so I called for an appointment to interview for the job, and I came over here, and I didn't get the job that day. It turned out that when I got there, it didn't mean anything to me at the time, but Dr. Odom was locked up in conference with a guy named Logan Wilson, and Logan Wilson was at that time Chancellor of the University of Texas, and that's what they called that job then. Now it's since called President and the Chancellor's Assistant, but then it was Chancellor. And I went up to the office and they said, "Well, we're sorry, but your interview is canceled. We found somebody else we know that is better than you anyway, even though we haven't talked to you, but they have a good record. We decided to hire them. As long as you're here, why don't you look around and see what you think about the place?" And I didn't have anything else to do, being unemployed. And I walked down towards the jetty where the old men's dorm was. And there were all these people up on this high porch there at the old men's dorm. They were all up there and they were just having a ball. And and they talked to me.
That was the
and-
Corps of Engineers building.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
originally the Corps
Okay.
of Engineers building. It was built in 1890. The university turned it into a dormitory. And they were really friendly people, but I couldn't understand. It was working hours, and they were all down there just grinning and carrying on. And about that time, the university's boat was out there in the ship channel, and it came and went past the pier and then made a fast turn and went away. And I didn't think anything of it, but later, much later, after I'd been working at the university, what I found out is Dr. Odom, that was a director at that time, he had a reputation of being kind of a pretty tough-nosed guy. And he didn't put up with a lot of nonsense, and that didn't go over too well with some of the academics. And some joker had made this huge sign, and it rolled up where you could unroll it. And just when what happened was Dr. Odom and the chancellor of the university were out on that research vessel, the Ciencia. And just as the Ciencia went down past the pier, they unrolled this banner, and it said Fort Odom. And that's what all these people were laughing and carrying on about, but I was just completely innocent and didn't know a thing about it, and went my merry way, and was really sad that I didn't get the job. And I got home, and my dad said,
Let me ask you this, John, before you go on. What was the description of that job? What was the description of that job?
well, it should have been Chief Flunky, would have been a good name for it. Administrative assistant was the title for it, and it was, at that time, it was just being assistant to the director. And what they intended you to do is to be in charge of all the non-scientific aspects of the lab, all the supporting operations, and all that sort of thing, which is, and the guy that they hired at that time was a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force that took the job, and decided, I don't know whether they decided that he didn't like it or his wife didn't like Port Aransas. That was probably what happened, because Port Aransas was not a paradise that we know.
What year
Back in
did they?
1960.
What year did they deny you this job?
That was the same year. That was the same year, that 1960s when I went to work, and that was 1960. I just, when I didn't get the job then in 1960, I went to work over in Corpus for Lichtenstein's department store, training to be their credit manager, which was probably the worst thing that I could have possibly done. Wound up in a little billing room that the ceiling was only 6 feet tall, and I'm 6'2", so that didn't work out too well. So needless to say, I kept looking for another job, and I saw one, after 3 months, I saw one advertised in the paper that looked oddly like the one that I had not interviewed for previously. So I called about that, and this time Dr. Odom talked to me. He said, well, I'd like to interview you. When can you be over? And I said, well, I'm working now. I said, well, I'll come right over. And when do you get off work? I said, 5 o'clock. He said, I'll meet you down on Shoreline Drive at 5 o'clock. And I went down there and sat on the seawall there by the T-head, and probably didn't say more than 5 or 6 words, because he talked nonstop.
This was Dr. Odom?
This was Dr. H.T. Odom, Jolly Red Giant as we knew him. Heck of a guy, brilliant. And but he talked nonstop there for 30 minutes. And it turned out that he had my old application, and they had dug my old application out, and he had called one of my references, which was Gene Richardson, the president of Del Mar College. And Dr. Richardson later told me that it was the same way when he talked to him, that he didn't get to say 4 or 5 words, that Dr. Odom talked nonstop about saving the world through research and the science in the marine, in the Gulf of Mexico. And even Dr. Richardson said, wait a minute, are we talking about the same guy? The guy I know is a business major. He's not a scientist. So anyway, he'd already decided to hire me, so I got the job without saying 5 words, and that was it.
As an assistant to him?
Yes, that's the way it was set up at that time, administrative assistant to Dr. Odom, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the early days that you took that job, and what was it like?
Well, MSI in those days was just a few little old frame buildings. The old engineers building that we've talked about, and the peer laboratory. And then they had a little building which wasn't more than about 900 square feet probably, and that was the administrative office, the library, and the ecology laboratory. And that's where my office was, in one little bitty corner of that, which your main equipment that you needed was a lot of paperweights, because it was unair conditioned. And we had to have all the windows open, and the wind would blow through there and blow all your papers off your desk. And I had inherited a typewriter that was probably about the second or third one that was ever made. And so the next day that I came, I brought my typewriter from home and set it on the desk, and Odom came by and he says, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, you know, it's a typewriter." And he got pretty mad that I brought one from home, because that was cricket with the university, but I got a brand new typewriter out of the deal anyway. And speaking of not being air conditioned, the classroom was not air conditioned even, and there was no budget for anything. And my parents had taken a big ceiling fan down out of their house, and it was sitting around in our garage. So I brought it over to the lab, and we had a good carpenter there named Herman Moore. And Mr. Moore, as we called him. So he was about 50 years older than me, so I called him Mr. And he called me boy, although I was his boss. And Mr. Moore built a frame for that, and for years that was how the students got cooled off at the Marine Lab. And the quality of the supporting staff was not real good. For example, a lady that was his secretary, is the secretary to the director, and she was the most charming little lady that you'll ever meet. But she was so out of it that old H.T. Odom, if he was writing a letter, he would take his typewriter and he'd make a draft of it, type up a draft, and then hand it to her, and she's supposed to make the final letter. Well, and after I got there, Odom decided, well, he better get me to proofread these, because he didn't have time to. So she's bring it to me to proof before Odom signed his name to it. And so help me, he had written a letter, and then he thought of something else, and so he wrote it off the side and put some parentheses around it and drew an arrow there. And that lady typed up the prettiest letter you ever saw on an official letterhead. And where the insert was, she put it off to the side and wrote the insert. This beautiful little curvy line around it with an arrow there to insert it, you know. So,
John, could you describe to us a typical week of what you did? Just think about what was in a week's time. Give us the tops of what you did in that job.
I'm afraid it depended on what week, because, you know, some weeks I mainly painted buildings. Another week I made sure that everybody got paid. Another week I did inventory. I worked on some science projects as well. I just did. I did the retirement. First thing, I think the first official thing I did for the university was to work on the retirement for Sam Gampert. It's old Sam Gampert and Joe Gampert, the old boys that lived in a van up on blocks there on McNamara's property right behind the university, and Sam had just retired. And I did his retirement papers, was one of the first things I did. So it was,
Did Sam work
kind
for
of nutty.
Did Sam work for Odom?
Sam was a janitor.
Okay, and what about his brother? Did he work?
No, Joe never worked for the university. Joe never worked for all I remember about Joe is that we had a refrigerator behind the back tea lab, and the Gampert brothers kept their food in that refrigerator, and Joe didn't have any teeth, and he would come over there and keep a pound of bacon in the refrigerator, and he would hold up that piece of bacon and gum it down raw.
You mentioned the Lorraine.
The Lorraine.
The Lorraine.
Yeah, the Lorraine. The Lorraine was a successor to the Ciencia. Ciencia was a vessel that was an old Army crash boat which had served for many years for the university. And one of the first things that I did was to have the Ciencia hauled out. And
could you give us a spelling on that as you remember?
It's I think this is how it actually is, as well as my memory. It's Spanish for science, I think, which is Ciencia.
Ciencia.
Ciencia. And
that had been formerly a Army crash boat.
it had been an the Army Air Force crash boat.
Do you know if it was the one that was stationed here in 42, 43?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know that.
Fair enough. And then she was bought as surplus, I'm sure.
Yeah, she was obtained surplus, and they were trying to get new motors for the Ciencia. But it turned out that she didn't need new motors. She already had 671s in her, but we hauled her out, and I don't know how many times she'd been hauled out by shipyards, and no one ever really going to look at her except the old boy who was her captain, and who wasn't extremely diligent. And when we hauled her out and I went and looked at her, I discovered that she's just about to fall apart. And so we had an inspection done, and the guy that inspected it the marine surveyor said she was in such a condition that she was likely, if she went out in the Gulf and came off of a wave, she would burst like a ripe watermelon. So Ciencia never went back in the water for the university, and Dr. Odom commissioned me to go look for a replacement. And I lucked out, went over to Corpus, and they had a boat for sale that was called the Lorraine. And the Lorraine had been built by old Captain Nelson back in about 1940. And this guy built a lot of great boats in this area. He had built the boat that the Port Aransas pilots were using at that time, a real good sea boat. And so we found that boat and bought it for, I think it was $8,500. And the Lorraine served the university very, very well for 20 years after that. The same engine, completely rebuilt after Hurricane Celia, so far as the top part is concerned.
Now, she had masts to sail as well as the engines, right?
Originally,
Okay.
the first 10 years of her life for the university, she had masts for sail, and she didn't come with any sails, but I bought a set of steadying sails after that, but she was rarely used with it unless she went out on her and held an axe over the captain's head. They wouldn't set the sails because it was too much trouble, but it worked real well.
Could we get a spelling of that name, that boat ship name?
Lorene.
Okay. And what was her function at UT?
Well, she did for our visiting class programs, took kids out for that from all over, but anything that needed to be done offshore or inshore at that time, although she was only 40 feet, she was used offshore. And I went out on the Lorraine. We had a guy named Miles Hayes who was a geologist working on his PhD in geology. And as I say, sometimes at that time the quality of the personnel was not that great, and I didn't realize it. And we were going to go out for a couple of days, so we had 2 captains aboard. And I should have realized something was amiss when we went out, and at night, we took out at night because we were going to start work early in the morning. And turned out they made a circle. And Miles Hayes was keeping up with this, where the boat was going. He said, "You guys have gone in a circle." Well, I discovered they, instead of looking at the compass, they were they thought the shrimp boat out there was an offshore oil rig, and they were sighting on it, and it was dragging back and forth, so they went in circles. And I should have realized then that something was amiss, but I went in the bunk, laid down in the bunk and went to sleep. And sometime around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened when I was knocked out of the bunk and I was laying down on the deck. And I heard that engine all of a sudden just roaring and roaring and roaring. And the guy who was on the helm had gone to sleep. And he had put her on the beach down at a big shell. And just like that old Lorraine was built like the Dickens. And it was built where you could go aground without tearing up the boat. And luckily, even though we had just hit hard enough to knock me out, we backed off. we backed off, and as soon as it got daylight, we went to work as if nothing had happened. And my part of the work was to turn the handle on the winch, because we didn't have any power on that little so-called oceanography winch. Was just a little bitty hand turn winch, and we were taking bottom samples with the Peterson dredge, I think. But anyway, we were taking bottom samples with this dredge that would get a clamshell thing that would get some mud and bring it up, and you had to turn that thing so that was thought that was funny way. I never expected when I went to business school that I was going to wind up out there on the Lorraine turning that crank to bring up the mud.
Is taking some of those marine samples, would that move us into your next topic, which were science projects?
Yeah, I guess so. Some of the things that, these are certainly not major things that were going on at the time, but just some things that I happened to fall into, largely because I was the innocent, willing to do anything and not knowing very much. They had a beach net project, which they were sampling the populations on the beach, and we had a really neat little surfboard that Dr. McFarland, boat that Dr. McFarland had designed, and we had an 18 horsepower Johnson motor and a really huge net, and you had a rack over the boat operator, and the net would go out, and we would start the net right on the beach. And my job as boat operator was to go straight out from the beach so far, and the other guy on the boat was sitting on the bow yelling at me which way to go, say this way or that way, because I couldn't see, because this huge net was flying out right in front of my face, and it had all the sand in it from the beach from the last time we used it. So the sand was pouring on me, and I was going through the surf. We went right through the surf and across and then back in, and then whatever was there, it was a sample of what was out there at that particular time. And I kind of volunteered for that project, and I enjoyed this crazy enough that I enjoyed doing it, and it was a lot of hard work. And some years later, I was a little bit disturbed when I happened to read the scientific paper that came out of this, and then the front, they had the acknowledgments, and by gosh, there was about 20 or 30 names there that acknowledged the people that contributed to the project. But I was included in there after all the names that said others too numerous to mention.
So they got to know you as other Thompson.
Yeah, and then I had another project that got dumped on me, which I enjoyed, which was Dr. Odom's project, which was part of the same program, was sampling how much the populations there were. And one was in the bay. They had another one that I didn't have anything to do with that was earlier in the shallow waters of the lagoon. And then the final one was in the Corpus Christi Bay. And they conceived the idea that the way to really get a true sample was to take a big net and drop it out of a helicopter. And so they had a guy who was a graduate student, who should go unnamed, in charge of this project. And he wasn't performing the way that Dr. Odom thought he should do, so Odom just ran him off. Later he became president of Lamar University after getting his PhD at A&M. Odom ran him off, and he had hired Bob Jones, who was at that time in the Navy. But Bob couldn't get out of he was an officer in the Navy, and he was on active duty, and he couldn't get off for I don't know how many months. And so he said, "John, you're in charge of this project until Bob gets out of the Navy." So there I was out swimming again, because it involved that. Once you dropped the net, you had to get in the water to purse it. So we had a marine engineer that was helping, and we had some students that were biologists that I wound up swimming, and I was almost killed when the part of the rigging on the Lorraine gave out. I heard a pop, and I just fell over backwards into the water, and there was a big bump there on the boat where I had been, where this heavy steel boom hit right where I had jumped off. And so Bob eventually took over that project and got it to working. It wasn't working very well at first, because when I was doing it, we were using magnets. We had a big frame, and we were doing mechanically. The guy up there in the helicopter would drop a lead weight down the line, and it'd hit this contrivance, and that would pull all these little lines together and dump the net loose. Well, it didn't work too well. And so after Bob came in, they figured the idea of electromagnets, and the guy just pressed this button up there on the helicopter, and that net would just jump off the frame. Anyway, there was eventually a scientific paper written about that, and Bob was nice enough to put my name on.
Other Thompson?
My name, I got graduated from Other, I got my name on that, along with the Navy commander who was good enough to allow us to use his helicopter.
In 1960, you started a job that allowed you to see two of the major storms that came ashore in Port Aransas, Texas, and that would be Carla and Celia.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about those storms.
That's right. Well, there was also Beulah, but Beulah didn't do that much damage to anything, except my house. Carla, when Carla was Carla was sitting out there in the Gulf and just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But I had no experience at all with hurricanes, and it was a Friday, and I didn't really know what ought to be done. And Dr. Odom was locked up in his office with the architect working on our new building project. And 5 o'clock, I went home along with everybody else. And home was living in Corpus Christi with my parents. And that either late that night or early the next morning, the phone rang, and it was Dr. Odom. And he says, Jesus, man, don't you know there's a hurricane coming? We got to get ready for this thing. And I understood him to say that whatever you do, don't go by the ferry because the ferry's not running. That's what I thought he said. What he really had said was, be sure and come by the ferry. And so I called up this fellow, Jesse Esparza, who we commuted together and was a real fine fellow, ex-Marine, and to come over here to help with the preparations. And had this old international pickup. And Jesse and I took out with the knowledge that we thought we really had to be over there, and that you couldn't go by the ferry, that you must come down the island road. So we got down there where the causeway starts, and there was a barrier across there that said road closed. And you know, I was young and single and nuts, and Esparza was a tough old ex-World War II veteran Marine, and we said, well, that's our job. We're supposed to go. Dr. Odom says go, so we go. So we just kept on going, and we got out there. You know, at that time, they didn't have the bridges down there where the Corpus Christi Pass is and all the different passes are. They have bridges now. They had just made the road straight across. Well, when we got there, the water was breaking at the beach and surging all the way and up, and a big wave would go over the road. And it had already washed away about a third of the road. And we still didn't have enough sense to do anything about it except keep coming. And old Jesse rode on the fender of that old international pickup, and we drive along, and there would be a big old board or limb or tree trunk on the road that had washed in, and he would pick it up and throw it away. And we just kept coming until we got to Port Aransas. And of course, when we got to Port Aransas, we discovered, oh no, the ferry is still running. We were supposed to come that way. And but even by that time, the water was funneling in. We had a brand new boathouse at our boat basin, which is right at the very foot of the South Jetty. And this boathouse had just been built on a concrete slab.
That was before Enco Marina.
Yes.
Cut through the jetty. Okay.
They had Enco Marina did that. They came a couple of years afterward. Okay. But the entranceway to Enco Marina, McNamara saved the right to do that. The entrance was already there, and the university had this little small boat basin there, and just big enough for the Lorraine and a couple of other boats. And so the water was kind of funneling in such a way that it was going underneath that boathouse, and it would have been possible, if you got between waves, you could have gone in and walked around underneath the boathouse, and then come out, and then a wave would come, and then that concrete slab would rise up. So anyway, we did what we could, which wasn't much, and went back to Corpus for the storm. And after the storm, immediately after the storm, I had a really nice little outboard rig, water ski rig, and I got in that boat and came to Port Aransas on my own just as soon as the storm stopped. And I got to Port Aransas. There was not many people around, which for sure. And I stayed there, I guess maybe at least a full day before anyone showed up at the lab, just trying to gather up things and protect the place. And I almost made a foolish mistake and could have badly injured myself, because our University of Marine Science, the pier lab, the steps to it had washed away. So it's possible to get up on the pier with I got a ladder where I could climb up on the pier. And you know, I went out there on that pier and stayed out there for a while checking on things, which the lower platform had been completely carried away, pier trap net carried away, but essentially the building was still there. But I spent some time out there, and you know, just a creature of habit, I forgot that those steps were not there anymore. And I just walked out that pier and stepped off the end where the steps were supposed to be, but instead it's about 8 or 10 feet below there is the jetty. But luckily I caught my arm on I caught my arm on something and I didn't smash myself up.
What was the Celia storm like for you?
Well, Celia was more, at least for me personally, and for the lab as well. There was a lot more to see and a lot more damages.
Had they, but from was it Carla? That
61 Carla.
had they started the building project for the new buildings
Yes.
after that, and then they were still before Celia started?
We had not moved in, but the building was already there for that what's now called the administrative building. Yeah, it was already there, but we hadn't moved in. Well, Celia, I took a university vehicle and a small outboard boat with me and stayed in my parents' house over in Corpus during Celia, and I took that boat and pickup because I remembered from Carla that the only one, in order for me to get back to the lab before anybody else, I needed my own boat. And so I took that rig back to my parents' house, and then, but the first day, somehow I knew that I could get back without that, and I left that. And my wife and I took my Ford Bronco, and the first thing we did is go down to the Corpus Christi turning basin because the university's boats were down there. We had a barge that was down there, we had the old Lorraine that was down there, and we had the Marcia K, which is a 55-foot boat that Otto Kohler had donated to the university, and a real fine boat. And
Was that old PT boat that he had converted?
no, it wasn't a PT boat, it was a 55-foot Chris Craft.
Okay.
And he had put a couple of big Caterpillar diesels in it, and it was back in the late 50s. He had the fastest boat, Gulf boat around, and but you could go down below, and when it was going in a seaway at speed, and you could just see the hull just working. And those motors were so big and high that the main cabin had only 5 feet of headroom. But Otto didn't care, he just wanted a fast fishing boat. And after he died, his widow donated it to the University of Texas. Well, that boat was really beat up there in the turning basin. We had taken them there with the belief that it would be a lot safer place, but it turned out it wasn't. They'd been just about as well or better than the university's boat basin, probably. So I went down there to check on our boat crews, and they were all okay. And then there on North Beach, it got tied up in a power cable, got tied up in the Bronco, and I didn't know whether it was live or not, but I was able to get out of that. We came on over to Port Aransas, and of course there was no ferry service or not, but Butch Owsley, he had a boat, which is not the Lorraine, but it was called the Lady Lorraine, and he had just one engine running and no reverse. But he was just, out of his public spiritedness, he was giving people a ride as long as...
This was not Woody, this is Butch.
This is Butch. He was giving people a ride across the channel. And so my wife and my dog, Hound Dog, and I, the three of us took a ride over to the island and came down and checked on our little sailboat, which was down at the city marina. and virtually every boat in the city marina was destroyed, and the piers were all pulled up from the boats, pulling the pilings up and the piers up, and there were 50-foot boats sitting on the side, on top of the walkways, and here was our little 22-foot Columbia sailboat, which had been in a perfect spot, and we'd done a pretty good job of tying her up, and that little boat was just bobbing there, peaceful, no water inside, just as if nothing had happened. So that was pretty encouraging, and we went on up to see our house over on Lantana Street, and we walked up the road, and it looked pretty good. Well, it looks like we made it. But we went up the steps, and got up the steps, and to the door, we realized that it just seemed like there was too much light inside. And all you had to do is raise your eyes, and you discovered that there was no roof at all. I mean, no roof, no rafters, no nothing. All we had was the walls, which the house was totaled.
Is that the same house you live in now?
That's the house we live in now. It was totaled as far as the insurance company was concerned.
Right.
We salvaged the house and rebuilt it. The thing about Celia, yeah, I haven't told you about the next day. The next day was a funny day. I call it the funny day because we had already been over to Port Aransas, checked out the lab, checked out our house and our boat and all that, went back, spent the night in Corpus. By that time, the officialdom had gotten organized, and they had the ferries running. And so we came up to the ferries. My wife had my Bronco, and I had this university truck and the university boat. And it had a big sign on the side of the truck, the University of Texas Marine Science Institute, Port Aransas. Boat had a big sign on it, Marine Science Institute, Port Aransas. Well, here's this police officer interviewing people to see whether they would be allowed to go to Port Aransas or not. And so I didn't think anything of it. I thought, well, he wouldn't even, I didn't expect him to even say anything to me, because obviously a truck belonged in Port Aransas. But no, he stops me. He says, "Where do you think you're going?"
This is out in Aransas Pass?
This is right, but the ferry landing.
Oh, at the landing, okay.
Where do you think you're going? Just, you know how sometimes the police officers can be when they've got a little bit too much authority going. And so, well, you know, I work for the University of Texas Marine Science Institute. And he said, "Well, we're not letting anybody on this island except residents." So, well, I'm a resident too. And he looked at me, you know, with this glazy look. About that time, there's this guy from Port Aransas who was worked in handy jobs around town, and sometimes worked as a deputy when they needed him. And his name was Shorty O'Day. And they had Shorty O'Day there to identify people. And Shorty O'Day came over to this uniformed police officer, and Shorty said, "Oh, let him through. He's all right. He's married to Mrs. Fortson's niece." So I got back on the island due to being married to Mrs. Fortson's niece, the superintendent of school's niece, and which carried a lot of weight, but working for the University of Texas carried no weight whatsoever.
Tell us about the Longhorn.
Okay, well, the funny thing about that storm was there were a lot of positive things that came out of it, and the Longhorn was one of them. You know, we had the disaster relief, and the federal government was pretty easy with their money. They had some good people running that program, and you had a lot of paperwork. You know how the government loves paperwork. And you had all these forms that you would fill out. You'd have item number so-and-so, and then you describe what happened and what you needed and how much money you needed for it. And so that was one of my jobs. Dr. Parker was the director at that time. And So we kind of conceived the idea that maybe we could get a research vessel out of this, because the Marcia K had been beat up, but it had 2 good engines. And so when I made out that application, I had, I don't know what item was, like item number 167 was repair the sewer system at the little boys' dormitory. $157 or whatever it was. The next item was new hull for the Marcia K, $90,000. The next article was repair the fence around the experimental ponds, $3,000, you know, so we just put it in like that, you know. And by golly, if they didn't allow it, they said, you know, okay, well, you know, we had the evidence of the boat was beat up and the motors were still good. We're saving the motors. We're just going to build a new hull for the Marcia K. Before we did that, though, we, of course, the university wasn't sure we were smart enough to know what we were doing, and luckily for us, they didn't have anybody else at the university that thought that knew anything except Theodore Bauer was a regent for the university at that time. You know, had the Bauer Dredging Company, biggest dredging company in the world. And so Theodore Bauer called me up and says, hold on, don't do anything to that Marcia K yet until I have a look at it. And he drove down in his Cadillac and took a look at the boat. And he says, okay, you guys are doing exactly the right thing, and I'm 100% for it. And besides that, I want to commend the captain and crew of the Marcia K for looking after her during the storm. Of course, we didn't tell him that they got off of her during the storm and got in a safer. There was a big steel crew boat there nearby, and they spent the storm in that and let the Marcia K look after herself. But he endorsed the job, and we went around looking for a builder. We got a design. Bob Harrelson designed the boat, and we couldn't get any interest in the Texas shipyards in building the boat. We found this little shipyard in La Rose, Louisiana. It's a real good shipyard. They had some welders that worked building nuclear submarines, and in their off time for building that, and they had some to earn a little extra money. They would come build boats for the Cajuns right there on the side of the bayou. They didn't even have a building. They just built them out in the open air, and they pushed them into the bayou with a bulldozer. So they made us a real good price on building that boat, and university came up with some money to help with generators and such. We took those engines out of the Marcia K, and Jack Shankton was the Marcia K's captain, and he was the first captain of the Longhorn. And we rented a U-Haul truck, put those Caterpillar engines in the U-Haul truck, and Jack drove down to Louisiana.